Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming out. Really appreciate it. To start out the evening, first I'd like to thank Alan for doing this with me. Great. The first thing I'm going to do is just read an excerpt from my book, Light and Shade, Conversations with Jimmy Page. And I'm going to start out with a section on the band's biggest record, Led Zeppelin IV. It was the winter of 1971, and the executives at Atlantic Records were giddy with anticipation. At any moment, they were expecting Led Zeppelin to deliver a new album, and early reports were that it was their best work yet. A goddamn epic, it was rumored, and just in time for Christmas. But the label's seasonal good cheer was quickly extinguished when the band's formidable manager, Peter Grant, made a rather frosty announcement. The band, he decreed, decided that its fourth album would have no title, no mention of the group on the outside jacket, no record company logos or catalog numbers, and no musicians' credits. Atlantic was flabbergasted. No title, no credits, all hell broke loose. They told us we were committing professional suicide and threatened war, Page recalls. But the cover wasn't meant to antagonize the record company. It was designed as a response to the music critics who maintained that the success of our first three albums were driven by hype and not talent. We wanted to demonstrate that it was the music that made Zeppelin popular. It had nothing to do with their name or image, so we stripped everything away and let the music do the talking. The saga of Led Zeppelin IV officially starts in December of 1970 at Island Studios, located in West London. As the band members entered the recording facility during that bone-chilling month, their spirits were high, and with good reason. They had produced 3 consecutive platinum discs in as many years, and their concerts were breaking box office records the world over. As Zeppelin's popularity soared, so did their ambitions to top themselves. Unfortunately, the initial sessions at Island failed to yield any real mojo, so the members decided that it was time for a radical change. We thought it would be interesting to record someplace that had some atmosphere and just stay there, Page says. The idea was to create a comfortable working environment and see what would happen. Robert and I had written a lot of our previous album, Led Zeppelin III, in an isolated area in the Welsh mountains and really enjoyed the experience. It was very beautiful and there was nothing to distract us. This time we thought it would be fun to bring the whole band somewhere and hire a mobile unit to capture that moment in time. Page had heard about an old house in the English countryside a few hours outside of London that Fleetwood Mac had used as a rehearsal space, and he decided to check it out. Built in 1795, Headley Grange was a rather large 3-story stone structure that had originally been used as a workhouse for the poor and the insane. It was far from lavish, but its rough charm suited the guitarist just fine. Plus, the 200-year-old building offered something that had something much better than creature comforts. It had presence. It was very Charles Dickens, Page says, dank and spooky. The room I chose to live in was at the very top of the building, and the sheets were always sort of wet. Headley Grange freaked Robert Plant and John Bonham out, but I liked it, actually. I'm pretty sure it was haunted. I remember going up the main staircase on the way to my room one night and seeing a gray shape at top. I double-checked to see if it was just a play of light, and it wasn't. So I turned around pretty fast because I really didn't want to have an encounter with something like that. But I wasn't surprised to find spirits there because the place had a miserable past. One real positive outcome of us recording there is that I believe we revitalized the energy at Headley. The place became lighter as a result of our stay there.
Well, thank you, Brad. Thanks for reading. Thanks for having me. Thanks for writing a great book about a most fascinating figure in rock and roll history. So it's big, begin with the beginning of this. Tell me about your first meeting with your first encounter with Jimmy Page. What you expected and what you got.
Well, the first time I talked to Jimmy was actually in 1993, so that's 20 years ago. And I didn't really think about doing a book back then. I was the editor-in-chief of Guitar World magazine, which I still am. And, I had a chance to interview Jimmy Page, and he was really, one of my main guys. His music had grown up on it, was in my DNA. And, but the only thing that frustrated me about reading about Jimmy was his interviews were, he always seemed really cranky. They never really revealed much about the music. You could tell that he was more antagonized by the writers, and the writers all the time wanted to know about his, the parties and the playing and the this and the that. But here's Jimmy Page, one of the greatest guitar players of all time, one of the best producers, one of the best composers. And I really wanted to know about that stuff. So I took the opportunity to, to really ask him about those things that mattered, about the music and what made them special.
And in '93, that would have been for one of the box sets, yeah?
Yeah. Well, no, actually it was for the Page Coverdale record. And one of the funnier things that I remember from that is that I was talking to David Coverdale about Jimmy and asking him about him. And Coverdale said to me, yeah, somebody once came up to me and asked me, how does Jimmy strike you? And I told him, often and sometimes with a clenched fist.
So based on everything that you'd, to that point, read, heard, been exposed to, what did you expect to find when you sat down with him, and how did that match up with the guy that was there?
Well, Jimmy was super professional, but I found him to be cautious. But he always perked up whenever you asked him specifically about his music. I mean, you could almost ask him anything as long as it was connected with the music. And since I knew something about guitar playing, since I knew something about producing music, I was able to speak with him on that level. But the one thing that sort of really interesting about Jimmy is his extraordinary memory and his attention to detail. Even just a couple years ago, I remember he asked me, did you ever see if I'd ever seen Led Zeppelin live? And I said, oh, yeah. I saw you back in '73 at Cobo Hall in Detroit. And immediately said, well, which night? As if it was like yesterday. And I'm like, it was a long time ago. I go, one thing that I remember is that you and Robert Plant did this extended theremin solo in the middle of the song. It was really cool, but it was really weird. And Jimmy goes, oh yeah. You saw the second night. After we came off the stage that night, we went backstage, and Peter Grant told us, never do that again.
And so, over the years and over the different encounters with him and getting to know him some from one conversation to the next, did he remain as cautious? Did he remain did he keep that same guard up, or did that start to change, either from relationship with you or as time went on?
It's a good question. I think how our relationship grew was, I don't know if he exactly became more warm and open, but he grew to expect that I had really done my homework, that I was going to ask him really good questions about the music, and he was going to be prepared for that. And that's really the heart and soul of this book. I mean, there's been a bunch of books about Led Zeppelin or Jimmy Page's career in the Yardbirds. And they've all been about extraneous things, the sort of more sensational aspects of his career. And I've always wanted to know more about the music. And this isn't just any band. I mean, the Beatles, the Stones, they've all gotten those books where people, talk about what they did and their accomplishments in really sort of detailed ways. And that's what I was after. So Jimmy, he would almost prepare for our conversations too, and really give me great information about the music and really, really what made that band tick.
So you did how many, full-on lengthy sessions with him over time?
Probably about 15, 16, something like that. We usually got together like once a year to talk.
And when did you start to think about this in terms of a book or in terms of somehow bringing this stuff together?
Yeah. Well, I started noticing all the other people that were writing books about Jimmy Page and Led Zeppelin were taking all of my material. So I figured it was time for me to actually get busy and put something interesting together myself. So I was probably a little slow on the uptake on that one, but even as little as 2 years ago, we had some really, really great conversations that I think added to the overall context of the book.
You put the book together in a very specific and deliberate structure in terms of what you did with your own sessions with him, in terms of when and where you bring in other voices. What was it? I mean, you wanted to get to this side of the music that hadn't been sufficiently explored, but how did you conceive of the way that you actually assembled this thing?
Well, I sort of wanted it, the book's entitled Light and Shade, and Jimmy talks about his music in terms of that. And I wanted there to be different hills and valleys and different ideas that would enter into it. I mean, a lot of it is Q&A with Jimmy, because I figured most people really wanted to hear what he thought, what he had to say, much more than what I thought and what I had to say about Led Zeppelin. Yet I felt it might get a little bit too one-dimensional if that's all there was to it. So I did want to bring in a few other voices, and like any piece of music, it was more of a rhythm thing. I just felt, okay, this is good. I want to bring another riff in over here. And I have some good conversations in the book with Jimmy and people like Jack White and Jeff Beck, Paul Rogers, and I think that they added some insight into the music that neither Jimmy or I even had. So it was cool.
Do you feel that over that time, I mean, over 20 years of talking to this person about this music, do you feel like his own perspective on Zeppelin's legacy and on the music has changed over time? Do you feel like he has, that there's a certain grasp that he has on that and that's what stayed, or has it, certainly the way that the world looks at them has changed and crested and come up and down and come more in and out of fashion, and then kind of stayed at the status that they've finally been sort of the last chunk of time. But for him, does it, does that?
It's not really the way he works. I mean, it always seems like, at least from his perspective, that he knew exactly what he was going to do and what he wanted to do right at the beginning of each record. At one point he said to me, I wanted to have artistic control and a vice grip. It's because he knew where he was going and where he wanted to drive this band. And his attitude was like, I'm waiting for everybody else to catch up. One of my favorite quotes was in the book was I was talking to him and saying, did the critics not understanding you at the beginning of your career, did that bother you? And he said, well, we were just ahead of ourselves. They were thinking in terms of the 60s. And I said, fuck the 60s. I want to chart the 70s, and to me, that's his thing. There's no revisionist theory. He sort of had it in his mind right in the beginning.
As a guitar player, and as somebody who could actually talk substantially with him about the specifics of playing, did your opinion or your thoughts of him as a player change from hearing him talk about it or from getting further inside how he was approaching this stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, anybody reading the book, I hope that their appreciation of what went into the music would grow. I think mostly on Led Zeppelin III. There's a chapter in the book on the making of 3, and I don't believe that I appreciated it as much as maybe I should have. And it was his insight into certain songs on that record that made me go back and really listen to them and give me some fresh insight into what he was doing. On something like Since I've Been Loving You, which is a slow blues on that record, most blues songs are built around 3-4 chords, and that's it. And Zeppelin said, well, we're interested in taking this. Jimmy said, I'm interested in taking the blues to whatever that next step is going to be. And if you go into that song, he cycles through almost every chord in that key, plus some that aren't. And it's more symphonic than anything. He took this very basic, primitive kind of music and almost made it orchestral in nature. But specifically on something like the Immigrant Song, I was like, let's talk about that a little bit. Where did that come from? And he talked about how the band got together and came up with the opening riff, the gang-a-dang-a-dang-a-dang-a-dang. And he said, and it's great. And Robert sang that Bali High melody in the beginning of it. And it just hit me. The melody is the same melody as Bali High from South Pacific. And then he said, that those chords in the middle, that's like me doing a little bit of Link Ray, And then I'm like, yeah, I get that now, Link Ray. And then they're singing about Vikings. So then I really started thinking about this. So you have South Pacific, you have the Broadway show tune, you have Link Ray, and you have Vikings. There's not too many bands that could actually pull all those elements together into something as exciting as that song.
Purely as there's the producer side, there's the songwriter side, there's the visionary side. As a guitar player, what is it that you think separates him from virtually everybody else, or even those up at that altitude? Still, there's something different that he does.
Yeah. Well, he's not really the cleanest player, and he's not the fastest or flashiest player. But it's more about his very odd sense of putting chords together in harmony. It's very advanced and very different. I always go to the Houses of the Holy record, Dancing Days, No Quarter. Those are very strange. They use very strange chords in them, or the construction of something like Stairway to Heaven. To me, what makes him a great guitarist is his composition, and then plus as a producer, bringing all these different elements together. I asked Jimmy that directly, and I'm just going to read what, I said, Jimmy, how do you want people to regard you? What do you want? And this is probably as succinct as I could ever come up with. He said, many people think of me as just a riff guitarist, but I think of myself in broader terms. As a musician, I think my greatest achievement has been to create unexpected melodies and harmonies within a rock and roll framework. And as a producer, I would like to be remembered as someone who is able to sustain a band of unquestionable talent and push it to the forefront during their working career. That's sort of what makes the guy great, you know.
I'm always interested in, with him, and similarly a bit with Hendrix, about the the early years, the apprenticeship, for him, the session work, and what that training and discipline and range positioned him to then go off and do. Talk about that
Sure,
piece of the story a little bit.
I mean, you can't discount, people talk about Led Zeppelin, but the reason that band came on so strong and was so sophisticated was that 5-6 years before that band formed, Jimmy was one of the top session guitarists in London. It was estimated that he played on almost 60% of the music coming out of London in the 60s. And that wasn't just, rock tunes. I mean, he was playing on jazz sessions and big band sessions and commercial sessions. He was often used on Burt Bacharach sessions. He played on Goldfinger, the James Bond theme. So here was a guy that not only was a great rock player, but had background in many other kinds of music. And then when he went to the Yardbirds afterwards, which is a great, great band, and his record with them is highly underrated, some fantastic stuff on it. He learned how to be a showman. He learned how to work a crowd. So by the time he came to Led Zeppelin, everything was in place. And he found musicians that were equal to him, but also people that he could guide, I think.
What's it remains an issue. It remains an issue to this day in terms of the most recent project with the O2 show and the film.
Yeah.
Is that power dynamic within the band? That's always been part of what they're wrestling with, and part of what would send them from project to project in this way. There's that sense that that comes through clearly from the book that to him this was his band.
Yes, and I think that was really true, and the other members of the band felt similarly until maybe towards the end, after they've all enjoyed a lot of success. And maybe they found the format restraining. But I think during the course of the band, though, everybody acknowledged Jimmy as the straight-up leader. But after the band broke up, everybody found their own way. I mean, particularly Robert Plant. He developed as a solo artist. Wanted to take his music in a different direction. And, I think he probably feels that he had outgrown that relationship. And that's what makes it very difficult for him to go back to that.
So I know the point of the book, was to do the music and stay away from the occult and the freak show side of the usual tabloid Jimmy story. But when you're with him, obviously he's not hanging upside down from, in a coffin or any of that stuff. But
maybe.
But do you see that, do you see where the interest in that stuff, where the charge from that stuff, is it something you feel when you're there with him?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And, that's a little bit of a misnomer. Again, in the book, we do talk about the occult quite a bit, and the sex and the drugs. He just wants to talk about it in terms of his art, and and I think, like, I'm trying to think of a good example here, but he'll acknowledge that, for instance, his famous symbol, the Z, the big Zeppelin thing, is something called a magical sigil, and that there was magical intent underneath that. And he'll say to me, look, I never tried to hide that. I was the guy that made sure they wrote "Do What Thou Wilt" in the wax of Led Zeppelin III. And in the book he talks about how his clothes took on a magical ceremonial element in 77. and that, Crowley had a big influence on him. I mean, he's one of the largest collectors of Crowley stuff, and I've been to his house, and I'm like, oh, what's that over there? And he's, that's Alistair's ceremonial throne. You'll sort of see these things, draped around. It's just that he doesn't like anybody's belief system, anybody's religion. He just doesn't want it trivialized. So there's a big section in the book about his occult leanings, my explanation about it, and about his occult bookstore that he had during the 70s.
I have two quick things I want to make sure to get through. One is to talk about the post-Zeppelin work a little bit.
Yeah.
And what, it's certainly not been an easy road in terms of what's come out and what hasn't come out.
Right.
And how do you look across the landscape of what's happened since 1980 with the work that he's done?
Well, it's sort of weird. I mean, he's actually done a lot of work. I mean, most people think maybe it hasn't been of the magnitude of Led Zeppelin, but, he put out a solo album. He did a couple of movie soundtrack things. He's been in charge of the Zeppelin archives. He did, 2 records with Page and Plant. He hasn't been terribly prolific, but he hasn't exactly been a hermit. He did the record with the Black Crowes. And I think that, and the Firm, of course, so what was actually a pleasure of doing this book was going back to those moments I might have overlooked or not thought of in quite a while, and found some really fantastic things there. Like, I think somebody could cover Satisfaction Guaranteed by the Firm right now and could have a hit record, there are beautiful instrumentals like Emerald Eyes off of his solo career. And I think, like a lot of Walking into Clarksdale, the Page and Plant record, was very contemporary sounding and a really good record. But seriously, I know that Jimmy's worked on he's got one really, really, really big project he's been working on for a while that he keeps threatening to unleash. And then he says Led Zeppelin just keeps rearing its head, taking me away from it. So I don't know. I think we'll hear some new music out of him. I think we will.
I hope it's so.
Yeah.
So last thing, and then we'll go to questions there. But
Sure.
What's your own, what's your favorite Jimmy Page moment? Let's assume it's a Zeppelin moment. It doesn't have to be, but if you've got to choose one, what's the one?
Well, the Zeppelin moment, the song that I think is the best is Achilles' Last Stand is my favorite, because it has all these progressive elements to it, but it's also got, it's completely got balls to it, which is what makes Led Zeppelin great. What separates them from all the other bands is that, this great sense of harmony, melody, but also this, sense of excitement and strength. And I think it also has one of Jimmy's best guitar solos on it, too. How about you, Alan? What's your favorite?
God, it's I have a funny. As a child of the '80s, I grew up with I resisted Zeppelin for a long, long time because there were so many terrible bands that claimed, that that's where they came from,
right.
And so it took a long time for me to really be able to hear what was really going on there. So lately, it's been a lot of like the funk. I mean, a lot of sort of Trampled Underfoot, Custard Pie, those kind of tracks. But if it's the one that turned me was Over the Hills and Far Away on Houses of the Holy.
Yeah.
As a song that just kind of showed everything that they could do, that it had all the textures, that it went up and down and went through a journey like that. That was really the one where I said, there's more here than I've given them credit for growing up. And so I've always got to sort of put that as a favorite.
Yeah. Yeah. I've sort of like you, like a lot of the biggies, you can't even almost listen to them anymore. So I've been finding myself going back to 3 and Presence and some of the other records. It's great.
Okay. So we'll go to any questions from any of you guys.
You'd mentioned Jimmy Page. You feel like he hadn't gotten his fair share as in terms of books that had been written about him, and that was an inspiration for you. Who else is out there that you feel has not been properly documented? Are there other artists that you would like to explore in terms of a possible book, or anybody who you just feel hasn't gotten their voice heard in a proper way?
You know, that's becoming a rarer thing. A lot of people have gone over the classic rock thing. You know, you have magazines like Mojo or even Guitar World where we examine that. One guy that I would really like to hear his story, I find him sort of a fascinating character, and I think that there might be a book in the works, is John Fogerty, who I think is playing tonight actually with Dave Grohl. Creedence Clearwater Revival. Fascinating band. Timeless music. You know, completely, I think, helped invent modern country music. You know, and a guy that had this meteoric career that went on for like 3 or 4 years, and then he disappears for like 15 years. And it's just a lot of it. I think John's story would be cool.
Leaving aside the book side of that, just in terms of guitar players, do you have a favorite underrated, whether they've got a great story to tell or not? Is there anybody that you look at as really underappreciated?
Yeah, actually, I don't know how I missed it. I actually blogged about this the other day because there was this one guitar player. I mean, I should know about him. I've heard about him. I knew he was fantastic. And I just never sat down and really listened to him. And I just did recently. And he's great. And I don't know why I never did. But Mike Bloomfield is a fantastic guitar player. And, you know, from what I understand, he has a pretty interesting and unusual story as well.
It's a story to tell, but a tough one to
tough
pull
one.
out.
Yeah.
Hi. I was wondering if any of your conversations after with Jimmy, you heard a new track and you kind of were like, oh, I understood what he was saying now. Maybe during the conversation, he was speaking about what he was doing and you didn't really get it. And then you just had that aha moment and what that was like. Or if there was like foreshadowing from previous conversations over 20 years and a track, 20 years later really rang a bell of a previous conversation that you had with him.
Yeah, I think there's been a bunch of those things. I mean, where he's talked about a track in detail, and then all of a sudden I went back to it and I said, I didn't really notice that. I mean, I think he considers really his recording pinnacle is probably when the levee breaks. And, he was mentioning, there's this backwards guitar on it, and then every time a verse comes around, we add another new layer onto it, new layer until it builds and builds, and then we do this swirling thing with the mix at the end, And I've always loved that song, great hypnotic song, but if you really sit down, it's one of those things you put on the headphones and you start going, okay, put this in. Oh, the next time it goes around, it's got that, it's got that, it's got that. But I think also, I was saying earlier, I was sort of cracking up with Immigrant Song. Great song, but the revelation that Plant sort of borrowed a little from Bali High, and that the crashing chords, the E and the A, and a grang right before the vocals come in, was sort of a pinch of Link Wray's Rumble, and then going back and listening to Rumble and hearing that, I was like, that's really cool, and Zeppelin always sort of gets, everybody says, oh, they stole this, they stole that, they took this. But to me, I don't know about you, Alan, but I think one of the most interesting about music is shared tradition. Our people, getting things from previous things. Any musician that tells you that they just made up something and it came from absolutely nowhere is lying to you, I love folk music. I worked at a folk and bluegrass store. There's a song called "Will the Circle Be Unbroken," and I love that kind of stuff. Like, oh, he got that. Of course, if the musician didn't put their own unique spin on it, then we wouldn't care, but they put their own unique spin on it.
Jimmy's sensitivity about critics not liking Led Zeppelin,
Yeah.
not acknowledging it. When he would talk about it, would there be a moment when he'd suddenly be aware, hey, you're one of them? And would either his body language or suddenly would darts come out of his eyes towards you?
Did you have to take the hit for all the rest?
Yeah. You know, I like I said, I spent a lot of time with him, 2-3 hours at a stretch. And I don't think that there was any time when I was actually interviewing him that notion wasn't present, that he wasn't ready to say to me, you got that wrong, or, how dare you, like he was almost waiting to pounce and to right the wrongs. And that was actually sort of the tricky part about interviewing him, was like, look, I'm here to celebrate your art, your music. I'm not here to kiss your ass, but you know what? I consider you to be one of the great artists of the 20th century, great musicians. I want to know how you did your thing. I want to really understand that, because it's historically important. And it always seems funny to put Led Zeppelin in historic perspective like you do the Beatles or the Stones or the Who. But they're an important band. They changed the way many things are being recorded. The way Jimmy recorded John Bonham's drums had major impact on popular music. He was one of the first guys to take the drums and put them right up there with the vocals. And that's the way music is listened to now in contemporary music. It's the vocals, the drums, and sort of everything else. That's a thing. That's a Page invention. So I think once he sort of understood that that's what I was there for, he'd let me go. But he was always waiting for me to.
I mean, I've not spent real time with him. I've had a couple of phone conversations with him, which have always gone fine and perfectly pleasant. But every time, unsolicited, he will bring up how the critics didn't understand, how they all missed what they were doing. How like it's clearly. I mean, I don't know if it's never far from his mind, but when he's in that setting, it's obviously never far from his mind.
Yeah, and it's sort of weird. I sort of find people, if anybody had any criticism about the book, it was more of like, well, you didn't get the sex and the drugs and all this. But, we would talk a little bit about the drugs and we would talk a little bit about this. And it'd always be sort of like, okay, let's talk about that. And he'd be like, well, he'd sort of size me up and be like, well, you've had sex before, right? And I'd be like, yeah. And he'd be like, with a girl? Yeah. Well, just think about it in terms of having many, 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 many. and you tell me, if you think that that's a good thing or not, So really, it gets to be a little absurd, especially when the guy has created such a great body of work to sort of obsess about that kind of thing.
I think there's a legitimate context in which to bring some of that stuff up.
Yeah.
In terms of, where and how it did impact what the work was, what the environment was, and what that sense of, if it is about the kind of questing and pushing yourself to those limits and experiencing those things, that's not completely divorced from
no, it's not
what you're creating. And
no,
I think sometimes
not.
That, they're a little disingenuous about recognizing that, but not then going in any further. And that's not just him. That's,
But I think any idiot can have sex and do drugs, but not anybody can write Stairway to Heaven. So for me, that was more important to get at. And there had just been other people that had gone there many, many times,
Hey, man.
Hey, Bill.
A couple people and yourself have mentioned Link Ray tonight. And I think if you ask most people what their favorite scene in the movie It Might Get Loud is, it's the scene where Jimmy's in his music room and he puts on a 45 of Rumble by Link Ray and starts air guitaring, which is a pretty surreal scene in itself. I'm just wondering, he's such a big music fan and it comes across in that scene. Have you ever had the experience of listening to music with Jimmy and seeing that big music fan in him come out in the same way?
Yeah, actually, when he was in town to promote the movie, the DVD Celebration Day, we went to the Iridium to see Joe Walsh play, and Joe had actually sold Jimmy the Les Paul the famous Les Paul that Jimmy used in the Zeppelin heyday. And he's a huge music fan. And, he just had a great time watching Joe in this session, in this thing. And, the other thing that's interesting about him is he will never say a bad thing about another musician. Like, for him, they're in a brotherhood doing all the same kinds of things. So he's a huge music fan. One interesting thing is, just recently, I can't remember how it came up, but he was saying, the one thing nobody ever asked me about is Buddy Holly. And Buddy Holly was a huge thing. And again, that came up with Eric Clapton. They just did a replica of
this new line of the guitars,
of his new line of guitars. And the reason that he picked up a Stratocaster was because of Buddy Holly.
Right.
Nobody ever thinks about Buddy Holly as being the big guitar hero, but huge influence on those guys. It's interesting.
Well, and then a huge influence on the Dylans and the Beatles of the world,
yeah.
because he was writing.
Yeah.
So a lot that Buddy Holly was doing.
Hi. One of the things I've noticed in listening to Led Zeppelin now is the poetry of the music. Like, I find as a band from that time that they have a very driving, hard sound, which was very rock and roll, but there's a lot of unpredictable moments in the music which are very beautiful. And I was surprised when you said they were riffing on things like Bally High and Vikings I'd heard. But what I wondered is, were they reconstructing that with every performance or relying on some improv to get their sound? Because I'm amazed when I'm hearing some of the tracks that they are as poetic as they are. Like, were they rehearsing that, or was that just like magic on some nights and not always something they kept doing?
Well, that's a really good question, because one of the things that comes up with in almost every conversation with Jimmy, besides his hatred of my ilk, is something that he calls the alchemy between, especially in Led Zeppelin. He would always say it was the four of us together creating a mysterious fifth element, and he would and a lot of times he would talk about how the magic would come through them. So when you write and create music, I think it comes to you in all sorts of different ways, and some of it is, you have to sort of muscle your way through and think about, and then others it just mysteriously pops up. But I think the combination of those four people, they were able to create a lot more magic than most were. And he would also say, every night, especially in performances, they wanted it to be different.
I think that, and I hope that I'm remembering this from your book, a thing that I thought a lot about while reading it is, that I can't think of another band, even a band of that magnitude, where the balance between the players, where the strength of each piece is so distinct and so strong.
Right.
That, I mean, you can't get into it like who's better, the Stones or the Who or Zeppelin or whatever it is, but there is a different thing about the way those guys played together than the way those other bands played together, in terms of it's not a leader and follower. It's this really precise balance of pieces.
Right. Well, there's an interview in the book with Danny Goldberg, who was their. He was a PR guy for them, but he went on to manage Nirvana and the Allman Brothers and a bunch of other people, and a really smart, intelligent guy. And he was saying, when you take a band and their most low-key player, he wouldn't call it their weakest link, is the bass player, and that bass player is John Paul Jones, who any band would give their left arm to have in their band. That's a pretty damn good band when the bass player is somebody who can write something like Black Dog or Celebration.
It's funny. I've had people say that the big revelation watching the big takeaway from watching the recent Celebration Day DVD was their appreciation for John Paul Jones.
Oh yeah, guys.
I mean, in terms of who's underrated in a band next to Jimmy Page and John Bonham.
Yeah.
That's not a not a weak link, but there's all kinds of things that he's bringing in, and I think that that combination of elements is really, it's truly unique.
Yeah.
Guys, let's have a really warm round of applause for our guest tonight.
Thank you guys
Brad
so much.
Tolinski, and of course for Alan Light. Please.